Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Father Andrew Mattingly. I am a Catholic priest in Kansas City, Missouri, and this is a podcast where I post homilies and random other stuff that I might teach or speak about. Hope you find something useful and maybe even inspiring. God bless you.
Good morning, Father.
Good morning, Joe.
Thanks for joining me this morning. The last time we recorded, we gave the parish some updates over the last 1 to 2 years. Today, we're going to do a topic of formation, which I'm really excited about. You, as the pastor, are going to talk to your parishioners about what a parish is, which is kind of a fun topic that's super relevant. Before we jump in to the topic formally, I wanted to ask you kind of a contextual question. In some sense, I think everybody knows what a parish is because we go to one, we know where it is, we know what it looks like. On the other hand, I think in another sense, we probably don't have a great definition of what a parish is. So maybe my initial question is, why is it that you want to talk about this? What's the purpose behind wanting to talk about something that's seemingly obvious?
It's a great question, and I think part of it's just a personal interest of mine. So I like studying the various structures that are defined in the church. The church is similar to, Jesus having both a divine nature and a human nature. The church, his bride, is similar in that she has this spiritual component and this practical, physical component of her various structures. So things like parishes, dioceses, schools, tribunals, just all these various visible structures that are part of the church are the channels, if you will, by which grace comes to us. And so, especially as a priest who's involved in a more intimate way in these different structures in the church, I find it fascinating how over the centuries the church has come to shape and mold these various structures so that they're as effective as possible in transmitting grace to us. That's one reason. Another reason I think it's helpful to look at a question that may seem pretty boring at first glance, like what is a parish? I don't care. I mean, it's where I go on Sunday. But I think another reason it's pertinent today is that since the Industrial Revolution 200 or 300 years ago, society has changed so rapidly, like the structures and the layout of society, that it's not as obvious or easy to define these structures. Like if you're a bishop or a priest in particular, you have to do a lot more careful thought as to how should you sort of have it's almost like a chessboard. And as a bishop or priest, you're trying to figure out how to actually move these pieces around so that they can most effectively sort of meet the spiritual needs of the faithful, so that they can most effectively evangelize. Pre-Industrial Revolution, I mean, if you were a pastor of a parish, there wasn't really anything super complicated for the most part. It was I'm in this little town in France or something, and there's 400 or 500 people in my town. They all belong to my church. I'm in charge of getting them to heaven. And basically the way that people are living is the same as their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, and the way I'm shepherding them as pastor is the same as the pastor before me and before him and before him. There weren't these massive upheavals, but since the Industrial Revolution, things have just shifted so fast and on such a large scale. This is why we see restructuring of dioceses, right, in the Midwest and the East Coast, where they're having to consolidate or close or do creative things with parishes. And so whether we like it or not, I think especially the pastors of the church have a duty to think very carefully about these different structures.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It makes sense that as things become more complicated, you kind of have to go back to basics. And I also like the idea that it's a chessboard, because we do have these structures in place. So we have tools, so to speak, to use, but they tend to change over time, or at least in terms of how they are used based on the context. Okay, so I imagine one of our themes today is going to be kind of the comparing and contrasting of what a parish is maybe today and what it looks like versus what it was initially. Maybe you could give us some context as we kind of go about comparing and contrasting what the traditional idea of a parish was versus where we are now, like you said, in the, let's say, post-industrial revolution. What can you say about how that context has changed?
Yeah, so we can dive into a short history of the parish, if you will. Obviously, any short history of anything is going to miss a lot of things and overgeneralize, but in the first 2 or 3 centuries of the church, before Christianity was legalized in the Roman Empire in 313, so in those first few centuries, Christianity primarily spread in cities and not so much in rural areas. And so anywhere a group of faithful, a group of people converted and that group began to grow in a city, there was almost always going to be a bishop in that city. So you might think that in the first 3 centuries or so, oftentimes today we would call a diocese would have been much smaller than many dioceses today. Like they're definitely, partly because there weren't as many faithful, but also just because the general idea was that if there's a city, there's a bishop there. You wouldn't have 4 or 5 cities without a bishop.
Interesting.
Clustered around a city with a bishop. And so one of the consequences of this in terms of the development of a parish is that in those first few centuries, the ideal, and you hear church fathers kind of writing about this, was that there would be one bishop, one altar, one mass, right? So the idea is that if you live in this city on Sunday, you go to a single mass celebrated by the bishop, and he's surrounded by any additional presbyters, priests that he would have to assist him. Now, of course, what ended up happening is that as converts grew and there was no longer space to meet in, the wealthiest Catholic's house because you couldn't celebrate Christianity publicly yet. When the rich guy in your town who's a convert, his house, it only fits, 50 people on Sunday, and we have 90 people now, so we have to find another location for Sunday Mass, a second location. And so this is when you would have a presbyter go out on Sunday, either to an outlying rural area, if there had been some rural converts, or to just some other place in that city and celebrate like a second Sunday Mass there for the faithful. It seems from what we can tell that this was avoided at all costs, but eventually when push came to shove, if they just ran out of room.
I was going to say, that seems like quite a big change from one bishop, one altar, right, one mass, and then, we're going to send a priest. I'm sure that was I don't know, but it seems like even that's a big deviation.
Yeah. When this happened, one of the sort of rites that developed is something called the fermentum, which we still have a remnant of this in the Mass today. But in order to symbolize the unity that little new congregation had with the bishop, there would be an acolyte or a deacon who would take a piece, like a particle of the host consecrated by the bishop at his Mass, and he would sort of carry it across town or out into the rural area for where the second Mass was being celebrated. And then that particle of host would then be dropped into the consecrated, the chalice, the blood. And this was called the fermentum. And it was sort of this symbol that this new, this gathering of faithful around this presbyter were in union with the bishop, right? It's like we don't have room. We can't have the one mass, anymore. We have to have two masses now. But here's the symbol that we're united, with the bishop. In church documents, today, when they talk about parish and diocesan structures, they're very clear that Catholics should try and develop a sort of, I think one of the phrases used is like a feel for their diocese, and that they should have this very evident kind of loyalty and love for their bishop. Like he's, at the end of the day, like your parish pastor is just kind of a representative of the bishop, basically. Like, the bishop is like the pastor in charge of your soul, in a sense. So anyhow, so this developed, and it was around this time that the word parish also comes onto the scene. Parish, the English word parish comes from two Greek words, para and oikos. So in Greek it would be paroikia. So you can kind of hear the parish ring in there. And para is a Greek preposition that means like alongside or next to. Oikos is the Greek word for house. And so a parish literally was a bunch of houses that are next to each other. So the idea is that the presbyter goes out, to this rural area or this other part of the city where faithful have houses near each other. So it's a group of faithful that live near each other. And that was the paroikia, the parish. So we'll get to this in a little bit, but you see already here one of the components of the identity of a parish is geography. It's sort of like a set of homes of faithful who live near each other. So that was the first 3 centuries. I'll go quickly through the rest of the other 17 centuries. So after the legalization of Christianity, official parish structures in terms of even drawing boundaries for parishes and dioceses was able to be done. So let's say 4th to 7th century, this kind of like geographical outlining of parishes and dioceses developed. And then in the medieval period, the identity of a parish gets rather complicated because you have nobles who build chapels on their property and hire out priests to provide for the spiritual needs of their 100 peasants or whatever that, are on their estate. But then you also have parishes. And so like it's unclear. A lot of times these churches are owned by the nobles, but the bishop kind of has authority. And the medieval landscape was very sort of complicated. So it was around the Council of Trent in the 16th century that a real push was made to kind of clarify this whole structure. So parish life was made front and center again as sort of the normal kind of mode or community in which someone grows up in the faith and receives the sacraments and so on. The next big shift happened with the Industrial Revolution, as we talked about earlier, which caused a ballooning of like the sizes of parishes in cities. To give the most extreme example that I ran across, I'll give a couple examples, but in the city of Essen, Germany, in 1850, there were 6,000 people, and I think it's, from what I understand, a fairly Catholic part of Germany, 6,000 people in this town and 2 parishes, which is not great, but like it was reasonable, 40 years later in 1890, there were 200,000 people in this town and still just 2 parishes. Right? So,
that's wild.
Yeah. The average size of a parish in Paris, France in 1900 was 40,000. The average size of a parish in Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1910 was 50,000 people. So
these are like small towns.
Yeah,
not exactly what we think of when we think of a parish.
Yeah. So, and we see some of that in the United States today, this sort of, because of, the Industrial Revolution was just massive migration from rural areas to cities. And that's why you see this happening. We have somewhat of a similar thing still happening today in the U.S. in terms of movement to the South and Southwest. When I was studying in seminary with guys from like Texas and Arizona, many of their parishes were megachurches, you know. I mean, one guy I remember was in a parish outside of Dallas with 10,000 families, which is probably about 30,000 people, right? So maybe not quite Paris of 1900, but pretty close. And so we're still sort of reeling, in a sense, from the after effects of the Industrial Revolution and how much that shook up the sort of just day-to-day kind of life of your parish as it would have been 400 years ago.
Interesting. Yeah, one of the things I'm taking away from that is, yes, there's this idea of the unity between the bishop and the faithful and that kind of one mass, one altar idea. But at the same time, there also seems to be present a very clear natural progression, or this necessity to change a bit given the circumstances. Although the example of taking a particle of the host is a good way of saying that you want to try to remain as close to the original as possible. Maybe my question for you is, as we talk about not just what a parish is today, but what an ideal parish is, how do you kind of reconcile this maybe desire to remain how a parish was in the past, while at the same time not ignoring the limitations and realities of contemporary American society? So what's the resolution there?
Yeah, I wish there was an easy solution. I mean, personally, I definitely feel sort of nostalgic of like, oh, I'd love to have a rural, I don't know, Italian mountain town parish in 1600s, and there's like 200 families, and most of them have been in the town for centuries, and I know them all, and I know all their problems, and like everybody knows each other. And so, yeah, there's a certain nostalgia, I think, for this, especially the small, sort of intimate nature. But at the end of the day, we have to discern our present realities. Bishops and pastors have to discern that. That being said, I do think it's important for bishops and priests to have a sense of what are some of the general ideals or sort of descriptors that the church has for parishes. So if we can concoct a picture of like maybe a set of principles, if you want to call that an ideal parish, I guess you can, and then work backwards to like, okay, how does this compare to my current situation, my current parish or my current diocese? And let me see how close I can get to matching it, or how I can apply these principles to my current circumstance. I think that's kind of a helpful way to go about it. And that's, one of the reasons why I've gotten so interested in this topic since becoming pastor. It's like, I need some anchors. I need some principles so that I can discern the best way forward in like leading a parish.
That's great. And maybe so far, I'm trying to think of like what's on the list of qualities or principles of an ideal parish that we talked about so far. Maybe one is even just a sense of unity with the bishop and a feel for the diocese. Maybe it's something we don't have as much now, but say certainly did at one point. And then secondarily, this idea that a parish is a group of faithful that are more or less alongside one another. Are those maybe the two takeaways so far?
Yeah, in a sense. And we can dive maybe right into the what you might call that question or the identity of a parish. What is a parish?
Okay.
We've talked a little bit about the history. I would say one of the best ways to understand what a parish is, according to church documents, is it's this kind of twofold reality where both elements complement each other. Maybe a good analogy is the human person is a body-soul composite, right? So we have these two components that are both essential ingredients to what it means to be human. That being said, one is what we call in philosophy the form of the other. So it kind of has this sort of precedence, right? So the soul is the form of the body. So it kind of has this precedence. And I think you can use this analogy to understand the twofold identity of a parish. So in parish documents, especially we can say since the Second Vatican Council, there's been an emphasis in the realm of ecclesiology, which is the study of the church, on the church as communion. So you'll see that word a lot in church documents. I think it's one of the most common words that pops up in Vatican II documents in particular. So what does it mean to say the church is a communion? Basically what that means is that it's a set of relationships, like a constellation of relationships. That's what a communion is. And so the primary identity of a parish is it's a set of relationships. And in particular, you could say there's sort of two-dimensional relationships. There's a vertical relationship that every parishioner has with their pastor, and that he has with them. And then there's the horizontal relationships that parishioners have with each other. And these two, when you put them together, would basically form this communion. It's interesting that in canon law, the main definition that it gives of a parish seems to just refer to this like spiritual communal component. So in Canon 515, I'll just read the definition of a parish here. A parish is a certain community of the Christian faithful, stably constituted in a particular church. Particular church here is a diocese. A parish is a certain community of the Christian faithful, stably constituted in a particular church, whose pastoral care is entrusted to a pastor, parochus in Latin, as its proper pastor, under the authority of the diocesan bishop. So we see there in that definition kind of this communion, right? It's a group of faithful entrusted to a pastor, that's the vertical communion, who himself is tied to the bishop, so you can extend the vertical communion even farther. And then it's also a community of the faithful, so there's this sort of horizontal element. And we'll get maybe an even better glimpse at this sort of primary spiritual component of what a parish is from a document that John Paul II wrote, I think it was in 1988, on the laity, called Christi Fidelis Laici. It's a bit of a longer quote, but I'll read it here because it's pertinent. The parish is not principally a structure, a territory, or a building, but rather, quote, the family of God, a fellowship afire with a unifying spirit, a familial and welcoming home, the community of the faithful. Plainly and simply, the parish is founded on a theological reality because it is a Eucharistic community. This means that the parish is a community properly suited for celebrating the Eucharist. And then he goes on, and there's some other descriptions there. But it's interesting there that he contrasts it immediately. He says it's not principally a structure, a territory, or a building, which is how many people probably think about a parish in the first place. Now, with all that being said, the secondary sort of identity of a parish, which even though it's not the form, you might say, to use philosophical language, it's still like essential, is geography. So canon law will go on to say that as a general rule, a parish is to be territorial. That is, that it includes all the Christian faithful of a certain territory, right? So many Catholics may not know that what makes you a parishioner is where you live, not where you register. I'll get to registration later because I think it's very helpful. But you're just sort of automatically, according to canon law, a parishioner of the parish in whose boundaries you reside, right? Now, the reason we could say that the spiritual component of a parish is primary is that there was a time where there were no boundaries, right? But there was never a time in the church where you did not have a communion, a set of relationships between the apostles and the first believers and amongst the first believers, right? So that's one of the reasons why we can say that this is the essence of a parish, is that it's always sort of existed, whereas the geography kind of came later. But that being said, they sort of work together, right? They're complementary because we are embodied beings. We're limited by time and space. We can't be everywhere at once. And so just sort of by default, we're going to be limited in how deep of a relationship we can form with somebody based on how close we live to them, right? If I live across the street from a friend versus I have another friend that lives 10 minutes away, highly doubtful that I would be able to develop as deep of a relationship with the friend that lives 10 minutes away than the one that lives across the street. I think one of the reasons for this is that relationships seem to really blossom when there's a lot of unplanned, organic interactions. This may be taking us down a side tangent, but so when you think about a parish, like traditionally, if someone goes to the parish where they live, they're also probably going to see those people in a lot of random places, sort of in unplanned, organic ways, at the grocery store, at the park, et cetera. And that's very conducive to then feeding into that primary identity of a parish of like, it's this set of relationships, this set of bonds. So you can see how both of those sort of fit together in a sense.
For sure. And maybe we can save some of the more practical advice for later, but one of the elephants in the room, so to speak, is that here at Good Counsel, at least I would say, we fit the primary description quite well, especially with the description that it's a community particularly fit for the celebration of the Eucharist. Mm-hmm. And that I would say that, at least in large part, we are founded on the liturgy. That's the unifier that brings us here on Sunday. But it might also be fair to say, because of our geographical dispersion, maybe we're not doing as well in the geographic sense. Maybe what's like a quick comment for you on, I'm not asking you to give a grade, but how does that description fit our parish? And does that probably mean that we need to be maybe a bit more intentional with the aspect of geography, given that it's not something that's natural to us?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess we can get into that now. I was going to maybe say that for the end, but it's good. I would say, kind of like we talked about before, where it's good to know what is the vision the church has for like a parish. What are the principles, I guess? And then now, how do we apply that to our particular situation? And so it's definitely true that like Good Counsel is not a typical parish, right? I think 7% maybe, if that, of our parishioners live in the boundaries, right? So the question becomes, and we can get into this later with like discernment of one's home parish. The question becomes, how can we take the sort of ideal and apply it in whatever way we can to our current situation? So that's one of the reasons, for example, that last fall we launched these like regional groups so that parishioners would know what other parishioners live in close proximity to them, because those are the ones that they're going to have the best chance at forming those deeper bonds with. Also the ones that they would carry the most responsibility to kind of care for, right? A parish should be a place where we care for the spiritual and material well-being of each other. And the closer you live to someone, the higher the responsibility, right? So I would say that's one thing that we sort of rolled out last fall to try and, how do I put it, embody this geographical element in at least a limited way.
It seems like a good example of maybe circumstances not allowing for everyone living in the same neighborhood and we walk to Mass, but at the same time, trying to carry as closely to this geographic element of a parish as possible. So at least in that sense, it seems like a good intention. We've talked about before that, we live in a suburban world in the sense that everyone drives for mass, for work, to the grocery store. And so if that's the reality of the city and maybe our parish, then we have to, at least in some sense, make do with what we have. And so that's why I think the community groups, was a great effort in that sense. Okay, so we talked a bit about what a parish is in terms of these two relationships, the one between parishioners and their pastor and parishioners among each other. I think that's a great framework for us to use. What would you say now in terms of the particulars of how those principles are supposed to be carried out, kind of in the concrete?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, we can get into some nitty gritty here. I would say with the pastor-faithful relationship, on the pastor's side, one of his greatest responsibilities outlined in various church documents is for him to know his people. So the Council of Trent in the 16th century, I'll just read a quote here. In one of its sessions, in the final document, it said, "All to whom care of souls has been entrusted are subject to the divine command to know their sheep." And then it references John chapter 10, which is like, "I know my sheep, they hear my voice," etc. Right? And Canon 529 references this obligation of pastors to know their people. It says, "In order to fulfill his office diligently, the pastor is to strive to know the faithful entrusted to his care. Therefore, he is to visit families, sharing especially in the cares, anxieties, and griefs of the faithful, strengthening them in the Lord, and prudently correcting them if they are failing in certain areas." So I found this canon particularly interesting when I was looking at it a year or two ago, because it sort of presumes that the only way a pastor is really going to get to know his people is if he visits them, which is why we launched this parish visitation. But long story short, on the pastor side, he has this obligation to get to know his people. That, of course, begs the question of what size should a parish be, right? Because the larger it gets, the more impossible it becomes for a pastor to actually know all of his people. We can maybe touch on this very briefly, but a lot of sociologists and others have done studies to try and determine what is the maximum size of a human community where you can have some sort of meaningful relationship with everyone. And the number that's most often quoted is about 150, right? And then a community of about 500 people, you can have an acquaintance with everyone. You can keep that many names in your head, basically, but you're not going to have a substantive relationship of any kind with all 500. And then usually the number 1,500 is thrown out as sort of the maximum size where you'd at least recognize more or less everyone by sight once you've been there long enough. So parishes that have more than 1,500 people, I think they, in those circumstances, have to really get creative in terms of how do we break down this monster of a parish into bite-sized chunks, communities of 150 in this neighborhood and 150 in this neighborhood, and then, go down even from there. We have about 500 adults right now at Good Counsel. So we're sort of at that level where, the threshold where everybody could be acquainted with everyone else in the parish through a lot of effort, I should add. But it's possible. It would take time, a lot of time, for everyone in the parish to really try and learn the names of all 499 other adults in the parish. But it's possible. So I would say for me as pastor, I know most everyone in the parish at this point by name, but even for me, it's kind of a stretch. And, growing beyond this size we'd have to start thinking structurally about, different things.
Yeah, I think you've mentioned to me before that as the number grows, or just as a particular thing gets more complicated, you need more protocols, you need more systems, basically in order to help you mitigate the fact that you can't naturally know everyone in the sense we've been talking about. So at least that's one, I think, bright side is that even though maybe you can't do it naturally, we can implement some things that at least give you a better shot at it. And I presume that, you're obviously doing your part to try to know every parishioner. I presume, though, that there's at least something on our part too, in order to make sure that we're doing our best to make ourselves known.
Yeah, I'll actually give 4 things.
Okay. Wasn't expecting that many.
Parishioners can do to, whether you're a good counselor or wherever someone's a parishioner, to kind of foster that bond with their pastor. Actually, maybe a 5th just came to mind. But on a very practical level, committing oneself firmly to a parish home is, I think, very, very important. Now, it's true, of course, that we're all members of the Universal Church and members of a diocese, and we can go to Mass wherever we want. There's no canonical limitation on that. That being said, because, as you mentioned earlier, referencing John Paul II, because the thing that unites a parish together is the celebration of the Eucharist, on Sundays in particular, that's going to be the sort of power glue, you might say, to a parish, is worshiping God with these specific people on Sundays. So I would say a tendency, especially in cities where there are lots of Mass options, is for people to kind of float around Sunday to Sunday to maybe 3 or 4 or 5 or more different parishes without ever really committing to one firmly. This is particularly pertinent in the years that I oversaw City on a Hill. I saw this a lot with young adults. And I'll give them the benefit of the doubt because a lot of them are moving apartments, every year and a half. So they're going from one side of the city to the other. So it can be kind of tough in that case. But nonetheless, even if someone is transitioning like that, I still think it's very important to commit to a parish and to basically try and say, okay, unless there's something fairly significant that prevents us from going to this parish on Sunday, that's where we're going to go every Sunday. So let's say, 4 Sundays out of 5, we're going to be there, unless we're out of town or unless, we've had a family disaster or everyone has the stomach bug and it's just sort of, things are crazy, right? But I would say one thing that should be avoided is just it would be, 10% more convenient for our weekend schedule if we went to this Mass time that was 30 minutes different than the one at our home parish. I would say that sort of decision-making should be avoided, as much as possible. Because, again, it's that worshiping God with this pastor who's the one entrusted to whom my soul is entrusted in a particular way, and worshiping God with these specific people who are the ones that I've sort of committed myself to on this journey to heaven. So I would say just committing to a parish and going there on Sundays, unless there's a really good reason not to, is number one.
That's great. That makes a lot of sense. What about, I'm assuming these are going to be relevant, but much less so. What about things like daily Mass and confession? Would you say that those would also ideally be at your home parish, given the same reasons? Or is it that the Sunday Mass is kind of above and beyond that, those two things are a bit lower on the list?
Yeah, I would say those are not just a bit lower, but way lower on the list in terms of their importance for those bonds. Now, obviously, if someone can go to daily Mass at their actual home parish that they've committed to, even better. But if they can't, it's not really it's definitely not a deal breaker, because it's the days when all the faithful are required to be at Mass, Sundays and holy days. That's that's where the bond is sort of like particularly important. Same with confession. Now, there was a certain time in church history where the faithful were required to go to confession to their actual parish pastor. That was established in 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council. By the end of the Middle Ages, it already kind of faded. It had become customary to often go to confession to itinerant friars, Franciscans or Dominicans or whatever. And so that kind of fell out of use.
Okay, that's good to hear because I try to go as far away as possible.
Yeah, that's right.
Different diocese, different state.
That's right. Yeah, different language. Yeah. So I think for good reason that's not a rule anymore.
That's helpful. Okay, so Mass, Sunday Mass, number 1.
Yeah. Second thing I would say is, this again is for the vertical relationship with one's pastor, is to just register. Now, as I mentioned before, registering it doesn't appear in canon law. It has no canonical weight. That being said, because people move around so much in today's world, it's super helpful to register so that the parish and ultimately the pastor kind of knows, okay, like this person has committed themselves here to this community and to me, and I have like a responsibility for them. Something that can happen if someone doesn't register or doesn't sort of commit firmly to like a Sunday parish is they end up in the hospital and for whatever reason. And then the question is always, what's your home parish? Because your pastor is the one that's primarily responsible for taking care of your needs now. And oftentimes, we'll get calls from the hospital, and even for someone who's practicing the faith, they're not able to answer the question, oh, sometimes I go here, sometimes I go there, sometimes I go here. Or maybe like, I do go here most of the time, but I've never registered, so the pastor doesn't really know me, right? He's never seen my name. I've never talked to him. So I would say registering is super helpful. The third thing I would say is introducing oneself to the pastor upon registering. In fact, here at Good Counsel, that's the second step that we require for someone to actually sort of fully be a parishioner, is once they register, they get an email or a message basically saying, hey, just next time you're at Sunday Mass, introduce yourself to Father Mattingly and tell him that you just joined the parish, right? Very simple. And sometimes like months and months will pass and either they don't read their emails or, I don't know, they just forget about it or whatever. But until they introduce themselves to me and say, hello, I'm so-and-so, and I just joined the parish, like they don't get their, welcome packet and with all these pieces of information because that simple thing, it takes 10 seconds, but it's just, I think, really important for the pastor to see your face, hear your name, and kind of, at least make that connection. Even, if someone's listening and they're like, I'm in a parish with like 3,000 people, what's the point of introducing myself? I would say even then, like just letting him see your face, hear your name. And then if you end up in the hospital 2 months later, it might ring a bell. Oh yeah, like that person, they introduced themselves to me after Mass. So that's the third thing, just introducing oneself. The fourth thing, kind of random, is if someone is going to be gone from the parish for a long time because of some job situation, or I don't know, maybe they winter in Florida or something, like telling the pastor is helpful. Just be like, hey, we're going to be gone the next 3 months. Like, great, okay, so I won't have to wonder to myself, how did they leave the parish after I haven't seen him at Mass for 3 months? I'll know, oh, they're just wintering in Florida. I don't know. So that's helpful. And then lastly, on a much more spiritual level, obviously just praying for one's pastor, obviously super important, and one's bishop. Those are some very nitty-gritty things for the vertical pastor parishioner.
One of the things you mentioned that is kind of a new idea is what basically are the qualities that make you an official parishioner. Because I feel like, at least in my mind, and maybe the mind of others, one of the top things on that list is, well, I tithe here. Maybe I go to Mass here, and maybe I know this priest really well, but I tithe here, or I guess maybe registration would be number 2. I register here because, that's where I grew up, but I go to mass here. In your mind, whether it's a definitive list or like these are the things that I think hold the most weight, what are the characteristics that in your mind say this makes you a parishioner? And if a few of these things are not there, then, in my mind, at least, you might not be.
Yeah, that is a great question. And really, there's just one thing that I consider makes someone a parishioner. Other pastors may have different criteria, but based on my understanding of church documents and ecclesiology, really the only necessary thing is Sunday Mass attendance. So someone could be tithing here and come to daily Mass Monday through Saturday, but if they're not coming on Sundays, I don't consider them a parishioner, right? And this is because it is the Eucharist that literally makes the church. So it's the Sunday Eucharist that sort of forms the community of faithful, if you will. It forms the bond between pastor and faithful and horizontally among the faithful. And so if I'm not coming to the sacrifice of the Mass here on Sundays when I'm required to go, I would say that person's not a parishioner. Now, exceptions to this would be if someone has committed themselves to a given parish community and it's impossible for them to go to that parish community on a Sunday, temporarily, let's say, because their particular job requires them to work on Sunday and they have to go to the last chance Sunday Mass, right, to fulfill their obligation at somewhere else. Situations like that, we have, I think, 1 or 2 families like that here at the parish, and I still consider them a parishioner because it's literally impossible for them to make it to our particular Mass times on Sunday. But yeah, that would be the number one. Obviously, the church requires us to support the material needs of the church through tithing, so obviously everyone should tithe. But the most essential component is Sunday Mass attendance.
Okay, that's helpful. And I don't want that to sound harsh either because, as a parish and also as a shrine, we, of course, welcome everyone who's here during the week for daily Mass and confession, those who support the needs of the parish financially, even if they're not here on a Sunday. So, I don't want that to sound harsh, but it is helpful, I think, for a parishioner to have that understanding from you in terms of what's part of our responsibility to hold up our end of the parishioner-pastor relationship.
Yeah. I maybe add one more. I'm glad you mentioned that, Joe. I'll maybe add one more thing to this, which is sometimes, right, in all of this discernment about parishes is made complicated because of the automobile, right? If we didn't have the car, that's when, it sort of complicated the picture of, because you have way more options now of where you can go to Mass. So sometimes there'll be people who say, well, we split Sunday Mass 50-50 between this parish and this parish. And I would say a family could have good reasons for doing that. And generally when someone tells me they're in a situation like that, I'll presume that, they've done their discernment and that's their decision and that's great. But I would say if someone ends up discerning something like that, like a 50-50 split between 2 places, it would be good to kind of just convey that to the pastor so that he's aware, hey, Father, we're 50-50 between this parish and this parish. I know it's not maybe ideal, but based on XYZ circumstance, this is what we've discerned is, best for our family. And I'll say, great, but it's helpful for someone in a situation like that to just let both pastors know. And then if that family, if anybody ends up in the hospital or something, they can sort of fight over whose job is it to go, who should go visit them. But yeah.
On the front of the parishioner to parishioner relationship, what's on your list of practicals that should be relevant for them?
I'll just give 2 practicals. One I've already said, but it applies to both the priest faithful and faithful to faithful, which is committing to a particular parish. Because again, the Eucharist makes the church, and so it matters to worship God in the Mass alongside like a specific set of people and not just anybody. Now, obviously, we still have bonds with every Catholic throughout the world, but there are unique bonds with the sort of like local family that we've committed ourselves to. So again, just the principle of like 4 Sundays out of 5, unless something significant pops up, like we're going to be at our home parish. And that'll build the horizontal bonds. The second thing I would say is just kind of an idea really to throw out there, but I think it would go a long way to deepening the bonds among parishioners, both here and at any parish. If every parishioner made a commitment that on Sundays, I'm not going to leave to go home until I've had at least one 30-second conversation with another parishioner, right? Doesn't have to be like huge, but that I've at least made eye contact and had one, very brief encounter and conversation with some other parishioner, that I'm not going to do the sort of anonymous parishioner thing where I like sneak in 1 minute after Mass starts and nod to the usher on the way in, go to Mass, and then, right as the priest is getting to the back of church for the recessional, like I'm out of there, ahead of the crowd. That's to be avoided as much as possible, right? Again, sometimes there might be crazy circumstances and, someone has to jet in and out because of some emergency or something, I don't know, unusual, but 99% of the time, I think that would be good. I mean, if you imagine if every Catholic in the country committed to that, like in a year, the bonds among Catholics in the United States would be like 3x what it is right now. It sounds superficial, like a 30-second interaction, but it's important.
Yeah, I think the first touch point feels a bit superficial, but what's really neat is when you see them again the next week, you already have like basically an experience that you both can relate on. It was a 30-second conversation the last week. And so I think the fact that you attend Mass every Sunday builds, and you've mentioned this before too, to take it one step further. If your goal was not just to have that conversation with the fellow parishioner that you already know, but with the parishioner that you don't yet know, then, then the relationships really start to build.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'll mention here one more before we get into the last interesting question, discerning what parish to belong to. One other thing that I forgot to mention about the pastor-faithful relationship is that ideally, as a priest gets to know his people, his preaching becomes sort of tailored or custom-built in a way for that community. Like, he's gotten to know them, he knows their struggles, he knows how much formation they have, and so on. So one thing, I don't think many faithful really think about this. They sort of say preaching is kind of, it's just one priest is a good preacher and another priest is not a good preacher. But there's more to it than that, right? Like the way I preach at Good Counsel and the content that I give is based not just on what the readings are and what the doctrines of the faith are, but also of my knowledge of this particular group of people and what I think would be most helpful to them specifically. Whereas if I go and preach the same readings at another parish, it's probably going to be very, very different, right? And so you can't just sort of swap homilies on a 1-to-1 ratio, in a sense. Does that make sense?
It does. I think it also reminds me of what you've mentioned before, that as a pastor, to distribute Holy Eucharist to your parishioners is also one of those things that, in some sense, it's great to receive the Eucharist from any priest, but there's a unique relationship when it's from your pastor. And for you, that's you, providing for your parish. I think the the image of a family starts to be built out a bit in terms of not sneaking out after Mass, or that the spiritual father is giving a message to his children in particular. I think, that analogy starts to, I think take root when you put all these, when you put them all together. You had said that you're maybe saving one topic for the end here. It's a common question, I think, both in terms of the practical considerations, but also just kind of the theoretical principles. It's fascinating to ask the question. So, with all this being said, like, which parish should be mine? Where should I go on Sunday? Yeah. How would you begin to unpack that question?
It's so good. You said earlier, this is the elephant in the room, right? For a good counsel. I would say 50% of the time, like in my first few years, especially here at the parish, when a family would invite me over for dinner, one of the questions they would eventually ask is, Father, what do you think about parish boundaries? So they're sort of wondering, do you have any strong opinions about the commuter parish kind of phenomenon, So I'll say a few things on this note of, how to discern what parish to belong to. So the first thing to clarify is that belonging to a parish is good. So when we ask this question, we're not discerning between something good and something bad, because in fact, in a situation like that, there would be no discernment at all, right? An analogy you might think of, you can't discern between going out and getting drunk with your friends and staying in and playing board games with your friends, right? There's no discernment, right? You don't get drunk because it's not a good option. But with going to the parish in whose boundaries I live as my home parish, or another parish, you're discerning between two good things. That being said, when we sit down to discern between two or more good things, sometimes one of them, just point blank from the get-go, gets what we might call the benefit of the doubt, that my discernment starting point is leaning already in one direction, and I'm only going to end up going in the other direction if I have good reasons to do so. And so that would be the case here, where it's pretty clear that the church's vision for this communio, this communion of people, based on the fact that we're embodied, is tied to like geography, would get the benefit of the doubt. So I do think when a family sits down to discern this question of what parish we belong to, the first thing that they would do is to go check out their, if someone's new to town, let's say, and they were just, they moved to Kansas City on Wednesday. I was having lunch with them on Thursday, and they were like, where should our home parish be, Father? And I would say, well, this Sunday, go to your local parish and check it out, right? That would be sort of step one. And then I would say, if after looking into their geographical parish, they had good reasons to look beyond that, then that's when someone could end up deciding that that's not going to be our home parish and we're going to go somewhere else. So this obviously brings up the question of what is a good reason? What would constitute a good reason to move beyond one's geographical parish? And I would say there are reasons that are sort of fairly objective, you might say. And then there's a set of reasons that are more kind of circumstantial, based on one's particular situation and family life and maybe kids and so on. On the more objective side, if there's like blatant liturgical abuse or obvious like heresy or quasi-heresy being taught, that's pretty much, unless someone has a very unique calling from God to somehow befriend their pastor and convince him to adopt a different ecclesiology, then I would say if there's blatant liturgical abuse and heresy or quasi-heresy, like things that are legitimately wrong, then like you don't really need to do a whole lot of discernment about going somewhere where you can rely on legitimate sacraments and preaching that is in accord with the mind of the church. And I'll say from the 1960s until now, unfortunately, and thanks be to God, things are a lot better now than they were even like 30 years ago. But during the last 60 or 70 years, unfortunately, I would say in many dioceses in the United States, that one or both of those things, blatant liturgical abuse or like quasi-heretical teaching, would have been prevalent perhaps even more than half the time. So sadly, I would say for much of the past 60 or 70 years, there's very frequently been a quick, obvious good reason to not go to your neighborhood parish. Beyond that, though, and this is where things get a little interesting now because we're in 2026 and a lot of parishes are getting better, thanks be to God. The landscape now in Kansas City, let's say, is very different than it was even 15 years ago. So then you move to this kind of second category of like good reasons for leaving one's geographical parish that might be a bit more kind of, I don't know the best word to use, circumstantial or particular to one's family. So I'd say the most common one that I see here at Good Counsel that would fall in this category would be wanting to expose one's children to like a community and a liturgy that's going to give them kind of an accurate vision for what Catholicism is all about, right? So a family may end up discerning like, well, we're going to not go to our neighborhood parish and we're going to come to Good Counsel or somewhere else because we know that in general, when we walk in on Sundays, people are going to be praying and not chatting in the same after Mass. And that when we walk in on Sundays, people are going to be dressed decently, right? And that when we come on Sundays, the music is going to be in accord with what the church asks liturgical music to be and not like campy show tunes, And some people would say, music, that's more of an aesthetic thing. Should that really be considered an essential like component in one's discernment of parish? And I would say, actually, the church considers music, the languages, that it's integral to the liturgy. It's not this sort of like add-on. So it may sound like just an aesthetic thing, but it bears more weight than we might realize. So I would say like those are some circumstantial kind of particular things that I see families kind of discerning as they consider whether to bypass, their geographical parish and come here or settle back at home. Maybe I have a few other things maybe I can add, but
yeah, that's much better advice than the advice I give when I have a friend who says, I feel bad about passing one or two parishes on my way to Sunday Mass. I usually say, just take a different route. Like it makes me feel better. Just kidding. But one question I have for you that's I think a bit nuanced is, let's say you live in an urban neighborhood and you have like a neighborhood parish, like one that's nearby. Maybe it used to be, one of the ethnic parishes in Kansas City. So it was kind of, set next to a neighborhood. I feel like what you said makes a lot of sense, but maybe like two different kinds of exceptions, because I'm imagining a parish in more of a rural part of the city in which you're probably not going to be living like too close to the parish or even too close to other parishioners. Or maybe to say it a bit differently, what if you are a Good Counsel parishioner and you don't live in the boundary, but you live next to or close to other Good Counsel parishioners? So kind of this weird modern possibility of going to a parish that you don't live by, but you actually live near other parishioners who, drive to Mass alongside you. Where do you think those kinds of things fit into the conversation? Is that still not the ideal, but again, one of the examples in which might get someone closer?
Yeah, I would say it's still, while it's not the ideal of what you described of like, oh, the neighborhood parish where you all live, the 300 Irish parishioners all live in walking distance to the Irish parish, that's still the ideal. But I would say anything that moves the needle closer to that is only going to be a good thing. So like if Good Counsel parishioners, if there's 3 or 4 families that are like, and I've seen this happen over the past few years, different attempts to do this. It's hard with real estate, but let's all try and like move on to the same street or like the same neighborhood, and anything that can be done to like build that sort of immediate geographical proximity is going to be like a good thing. So I think the car is interesting. Basically any technology that allows us to overcome limits we can fall prey to this kind of illusion that it allows us to fully overcome the limit in a sense without realizing that there's still a drawback. Like, I remember talking to a parishioner a while ago who said, I guess he studied this quite a bit, that apparently there's a huge gap between how often you'll talk to someone who lives within eyesight of your front porch and someone who even lives, like even if it's a good friend, who even lives like around the corner, like out of eyesight. And then there's also a huge jump that comes from someone that you can reach through walking and someone you have to get in your car to go see. So there's these kind of like degrees of geographical separation that are going to determine how easy it is basically to form bonds, or on the other hand, how intentional we have to be to deepen those bonds that, we do have to get in our car and drive somewhere, So I don't know if that answers the question.
No, it does. So that, I guess kind of what maybe to complete my thought would be, maybe it's still the ideal to have that closeness while going to your geographic parish, but still much better to have that closeness even if you're commuting to Good Counsel. So, okay, good.
Yeah. And maybe I'll add just one other like practical thing here, which is, like in the last, 3 months, I think we've had 8 or 10 families maybe at the parish that have been here for a few years, but made the discernment to return to their neighborhood parish. Maybe their neighborhood parish got a new pastor and he's trying to, make some good headway liturgically and otherwise. And they're like, oh, we really want to support him. Or for some other reason, and when they come to me and say, hey, Father, like, we've discerned that we're going to leave Good Counsel and settle at our neighborhood parish. I'm never upset by that. Like, in fact, in some ways it's kind of the opposite, that like, it's a sign to me that the health of the church overall is like improving, right? And these 8 or 10 families, it's not like there's just one other parish that they're all going to. It's been like 6 or 7 different parishes around the metro. At the same time, of course, we've received at Good Counsel probably 15 or 20 new families, right? So the growth is still happening. And when those families show up and say, hey, Father, we were at such and such a parish, we're here now because of X, Y, or Z reason, the answer is always awesome. Like, welcome to Good Counsel. I trust that, the discernment is in your hands, like for you individually or for your family. And so I'm never going to like second guess somebody on that. I can provide principles for discernment. That's a big thing that like a pastor or spiritual director has to do with these areas of prudential judgment, is to never tell someone what to do. That would be a sort of misunderstanding of how prudential judgment works, but simply to provide principles, which is what we're trying to do on this podcast, that people can then use to apply in their own sort of discernment. So
I think you've shared obviously a lot of good information. I also think some challenging ones, just a couple that come to mind are, going to your parish 9 Sundays out of 10, which seems like almost an impossible bar. I think for some.
I think I said 4 out of 5.
Oh, okay, 4 out of 5. Whatever the number may be, to be consistent and to try to minimize the exceptions, or things like trying to have that 30-second conversation after Mass, which I think for some can be really easy, some maybe not. So I think you've shared some challenging things, especially on the front of the discernment of what parish you belong to. So maybe I'd say, despite some of these, challenging topics, but really important ones, what's kind of the takeaway or the primary thing you want people to have in their minds when they're chewing on this, when they're thinking about it for themselves? Because, I don't want anyone who's recently become a parishioner here that's come from a different parish to be like, I just, I thought I was doing the right thing, and now you've got me questioning myself. So I think there's some interesting dynamics here. What do you want to leave a listener with?
One, whatever parish someone belongs to, whether it's people here at Good Counsel listening to this or at other parishes, to just really try and take to heart that idea of the parish as a communion, as a family, and to just ask the question, how can I deepen that reality? How can I deepen the bond between me and my pastor? How can I deepen the bonds between myself and fellow parishioners? So I'd say that's the most important takeaway from this podcast. In terms of discernment of parish and geography and that whole question, I do hope this just provides more framework for people who are either in active discernment or who may have to discern in the future. If it leads somebody to question like a recent discernment, I guess so be it, But really it's just meant to, again, provide these principles that someone can then use to apply to their own unique situation. And ultimately, at the end of the day, they're the ones who are free to make what they believe is going to be the best decision for them and for their family.
I know that as a parishioner myself, it's helpful to hear these things, knowing that you have this framework. And so some of the decisions that you make here at Good Counsel are informed by these. So I can know that as a parishioner that you are doing your best amidst the current circumstances to make our parish as ideal as possible. So as a parishioner, that's good to hear. Thank you, Father, for your time this morning. It's always good to chat.
Good to chat with you, Joe.